So this topic is called pedigrees, and a little, I don't know, tongue-in-cheek. We use this term pedigree to talk about like the history of breeding, and sometimes it comes up with animals. There's a brand of dog food called Pedigree. You say, "What do you have? You have a good pedigree." Kind of refers to somebody's family history going back, right? So I find these interesting. You can get a portrait made of your animal at home where they put the head of your dog onto the torso of a famous person and really highlight how much of a pedigree you've got going back. But when we talk about pedigree in genetics, we're talking a little bit more dryly about something like this, a diagram that shows relationships. And you can draw a pedigree, it might look familiar to you, a little bit like a family tree. You can draw a pedigree that gets bigger as it goes down, or you can draw a pedigree that gets smaller as it goes down. It all depends on what you're focusing on. So this kind of diagram where we start small and get bigger, this is focusing on an ancestral trait, which is in this red color here, and who descended from this original person and might have had that trait and passed it on to their offspring. So pedigrees are useful for tracking the inheritance of genetic traits. And we'll be able to see that you can kind of infer the method of transmission as far as these alleles and genes causing the trait being dominant, recessive, X-linked, autosomal. We can kind of track patterns, and this is useful as one of the first steps for identifying, number one, that you've got a trait that is in fact passed on genetically and not through other means, something like environmental exposure. And then also determining the mode of inheritance and calculating the chance that somebody will actually inherit the trait. So you might have a genetic trait of interest. You want to inherit your great-grandmother's blue eyes, or you might have a trait that you're trying to avoid, some genetic disease that runs in your family, for example. So we're going to see mostly this kind where it starts small and gets bigger. And we're looking at the transmission of traits that we'd be interested to know in the current generation. What are the chances that these individuals have the trait and are going to pass it on? So just real quick, we can see that in this case, anybody who has the red shape is directly an offspring of somebody who has the red shape as well. So this is getting passed on genetically. Some people, like this boxed individual number 4, did not inherit the trait and also did not pass it on to any of his offspring. So your book has a pretty extensive set of symbols on this. I don't think most of these are important for us. I haven't run into a lot of pedigree diagrams professionally, so I think they have their place in a particular kind of genetics, say you were involved in breeding or something like that. We're going to simplify these way down. So the parts that are not shaded out, those are the only symbols that we're really going to concern ourselves with. So males as the square shape, females as the circle shape, and then this question of whether they do or do not have the trait of interest. So a lot of times we'll not even consider what the trait is, just do they have it, do they not have it? And then one more possibility is that somebody can carry the genetics for the trait, but not actually have the trait in their phenotype. So for example, if you were carrying a recessive allele, you might not show that as part of your phenotype, and that would be something of interest to know that you have that allele but are still not showing it. Other features that you see on pedigrees are the relationships that are diagrammed on there. So we've got some lots of symbols here. Again, your book does a little more complicated than we need, so I'm going to shade out the parts we won't worry about. And we're just concerned with generations. So these Roman numerals at the left, generation 1, generation 2. And for people to have children, male and female get together, they're joined by a horizontal line, and children that are theirs are connected by vertical lines. So this is a vertical line to a branching that then gives 1, 2, 3 children. Those would be the children in the second generation of person 1, person 2 in the first generation. Okay, so we're also going to simplify this way down. We're going to deal with traits that are controlled by genes with complete dominance in their alleles. So we're not going to worry about incomplete dominance or codominance or epistasis or anything like that. Just looking for an allele that in some fashion directly contributes to the trait. So we're going to be largely back to Mendelian, with the exception of these X-linked traits that we'll be able to see. So part of what we'll do with these, you'll have assignments where you'll get to determine, just kind of rule out possibilities and say, is it possible for this to be inherited if it was caused by an autosomal dominant allele? Is it possible for this trait to be caused by an X-linked recessive allele, and so on? So we'll have some examples of these. So as we're thinking about, we're going to sort of establish the rules for how certain kinds of traits are inherited. These are the kinds of patterns you might want to key yourself into observing. So do we skip a generation? In other words, do people get the trait from parents who did not have the trait? We'll see that's possible in a couple of these scenarios. And then is there any difference between the sexes? So sexes of parents or sexes of offspring? Including this example, the daughters of affected men might be a pattern that we see coming up. So let's get right into it. We've got some examples from your book, and I'll just basically spell out how these are consistent with a certain kind of inheritance. So to do that, I'm going to draw on here the genotypes that could cause the traits. So if we have a trait that is caused by an autosomal dominant allele, I'm pretty fond of these simple letters, so we'll just call this capital A. So this is a trait that's caused by the capital A allele. So if we have that as the condition, with dominance, the genotypes of individuals that could be affected, we could have a homozygous dominant individual or a heterozygous individual. And again, for simplicity, we're working with just two alleles, dominant or recessive. So in this case, anybody who has the trait, we know that they have at least one big A, and we can work kind of forwards and backwards through this. So the children of person 2, person 5 is not a child of person 2. These are people who joined the family from somewhere else. We don't see on this diagram where their parents are. And in these examples, we're typically working with something that we could perceive as a rare allele. So something that's not going to just randomly show up from someone outside of the family, just again, for simplicity's sake. So if this person is big A something, what about their offspring? Well, what we can tell from this is that if it's caused by a dominant allele, anybody who doesn't have the trait doesn't have the big A allele. Right? So to not have the trait, they've got to be homozygous recessive. That tells us that they got a little a from that affected mom parent. So we now can fill in the genotypes for their parents. So we know that the first man is all recessive because he's not showing the trait. And we know that she's heterozygous because she has some children who have the trait. And that means we could do a Punnett square of these individuals. So big A, little a, and then dad has only little a's. That tells us we've got two possible genotypes for the offspring. So anybody who has the trait has to be heterozygous. All right, so we've kind of deduced genotypes just based on how we know how this trait is inherited and based on the relationships of individuals. So again, kind of moving forward, we could X out some people who are not direct descendants, although knowing what we know, everybody who's not showing the trait also is homozygous recessive anyway. So I'm going to fill that in here. So this, working down this part of the family, two individuals that are homozygous recessive, they're going to keep having children who are homozygous recessive and so on. So this is a part of the family that basically purged of that trait, whether it's a positive trait or a disease trait. And then other cases, again, being a rare allele, everybody who's got it, as long as these people coming in from outside the family are homozygous recessive, then all the people who have the trait are also going to be heterozygous. All right, now as far as characteristics, do we skip a generation? Is it possible to be born to a person who doesn't have the trait and then yourself have the trait, that's not possible. So dominant alleles have to show, if anybody has the dominant allele, they have to show the trait that goes along with that. So it doesn't skip a generation, and because it's autosomal, we wouldn't expect any differences between males and females. All right, on to autosomal recessive. So again, here we've got, using the A notation, we can just make a lowercase a for the allele that causes the trait. And because it's recessive, it has to be homozygous to show the phenotype. So that becomes, I don't know, maybe as easy as the last one. Anybody who's got the trait is a little a, and anybody who doesn't have the trait has at least one big A. And this one we can figure out that this individual has two little a's, had to get one from dad and one from mom. That fills in their genotypes. And if we do a Punnett square of their cross, it's possible for them to have some kids that don't have the recessive allele. 50% of their kids would be carriers, and 1/4 of their kids would have the disease trait. So here we've got a case where somebody has the disease trait. Could be that it was, say, early life lethal, something like that, where this individual would not go on to reproduce, but the siblings of this person could be heterozygous. How do I know they're heterozygous? Well, I'm working up and down at the same time, and we know that in the 4th generation, this green generation down here, somebody was homozygous recessive. That means that these individuals had to have a little a allele. And we're going to, let's see, so we already know they're mating partners, and then they got those from, if this is a rare allele, would have gotten those from person 2 and person 4 in this generation. So we could do Punnett squares, but basically throughout these, could even assume that these people coming in from outside the family don't have that recessive allele, but it's possible for them to keep passing on this recessive allele down through the generations. And one thing that's shown on this diagram is, you don't have to know this symbology for matings between first cousins, but what it does show you is one of the negative effects of inbreeding. So you might have heard about inbreeding, you might have just realized that it's generally a bad thing. We talk about it in negative terms. Inbreeding is genetic mating or mating between individuals that are related to some amount. So related more than you would be to the average person, as in this example, people who are first cousins. And this is really, when we're looking out for inbreeding as a negative thing, this is the kind of thing that we try to avoid by encouraging people not to inbreed. It's the situation where you can have this rare allele that's a recessive allele, and if you keep mating among related people, they could recombine this recessive allele together. So something that might have been very rare, meeting up in the first parents, has come back again because of recombining the same alleles that are present in the family. So by mating these 2 first cousins together, they can combine one little a with another little a, and then again have an individual in the family who is showing the trait. It doesn't always have to be something like this, but this is one case where you can get some of those negative allele combinations together. Okay, so characteristics, we do see it's possible to skip a generation. This is kind of an exceptional case with the inbreeding. But it is possible for people to have a trait and be born to parents who don't have the trait. That's a characteristic of a recessive allele. And then we don't see, or we shouldn't see, any sex-specific inheritance patterns. Oops, annotate, skip, annotate again. All right, now we've got X-linked dominant, and so here we've got an individual, the allele of interest would be X superscript big A. Individuals who have this could be homozygous dominant females, could be heterozygous females, could be hemizygous males, right? So males would have only one copy of this, and then they also have a Y chromosome for their other chromosome. So here we have person 1, this is a male, and there's only one way to show the trait and be a male, so that's to have the X with the dominant big A. And here we get an interesting inheritance pattern. There were children of this pair of parents, 3 girls and 1 boy, and all the girls inherited the trait. So that means that they got this big A from dad, and from mom, if this is a dominant trait, mom would have been little a's all around. So children here became heterozygous, XA, and X little a Y. So let's maybe focus in here. We could do a Punnett square. So you notice the Punnett squares are useful for evaluating the possibilities. You could also use this in probability to find out what are the chances of certain combinations. So X little a, X big A, Y, X little a, Y. All right, so of this pair, 5 and 6 in generation 2, we would expect that they would have 50% of their daughters affected and also 50% of their sons affected. So there's not a difference in the chance of getting the trait if you're male or female, but important to track their genotypes anyway. So turns out, as we see, they had 6 kids, 3 got the trait, 3 did not get the trait. That's pretty consistent with our expectations. This individual, the female who has the trait, we can then figure out her genotype, because the only female genotype to have the trait would be heterozygous, and so on. So this being dominant, she would pass that on to half of her kids, and we see 2 out of 3. That's consistent with half. It's within the bounds of what you'd expect. Again, as a dominant trait, this is one that's getting passed on. If you have the trait, you need to have at least one parent that also has the trait. And then we saw one good pattern in this diagram for sex linkage, where all the daughters of the affected male were affected, and that's what you would expect from that, right? So the male gives the X to his daughters. They all got the big A that he had. And then on the other hand here, mom was little a's, so they had a son, and they got mom's little a and dad's Y to be a son of that mating. So definitely some differences between male and female chances of inheriting the trait here. All right, X-linked recessive. So this would be a trait caused by the X little a. So to have the trait as a woman, you need to be homozygous recessive. To have the trait as a man, you need to be hemizygous. We've got some carriers on here. Maybe I didn't have them all showing first. Let's see. So anybody who's a carrier as a woman, she would be heterozygous. In one case, she happened to pass on her little a to a son here. He passed on a little a to his daughters, so she's not showing the trait, but she does have dad's little a that's tracking down this side. 2 out of 3 of the sons are affected. That's consistent with what we saw ahead earlier. And here we've got a case where an affected son has all carrier daughters. And being X-linked and recessive, we see that it can skip a generation. So affected male in generation 2, unaffected generation 3, and then again affected males in generation 4. Looking at the diagram overall, we see that there are only affected males in this family. So this is consistent with what we've talked about before, that males tend to show X-linked recessive traits more often than females. So to show the trait as a male, you just have to inherit one of those recessive alleles and be hemizygous. To show the trait as a female, you would have to inherit two little a alleles and be homozygous recessive. So this predominance of males that are affected, that would, if you didn't know anything about the inheritance pattern, probably get you thinking about sex-linked inheritance. All right. One more kind is cytoplasmic inheritance. And this one, see, I skipped a color on here. Fill that one in. Cytoplasmic inheritance, there are some nuances to this. We talked earlier in the inheritance of mitochondrial DNA that a person could inherit maybe different mitochondrial DNA depending on what kinds of mitochondria their mom has. We're going to simplify it right down and just say that females give mitochondria to all of their kids. So the so-called cytoplasmic inheritance refers in humans to mitochondrial DNA. The egg contributes most of the cytoplasm, so also the mitochondria. So if a woman has the trait, she's going to pass it on to all of her kids. If a man has the trait, he passes it on to none of his kids, and we see this pattern continuing down. I did some editing on this, so you can just fill in number 9. Again, affected man doesn't pass it on, but an affected daughter, oh, there's another one, passes it on to all of her kids. Been doing this for a while. I still have this, need to update it. Okay, so this one's pretty simple. Just kind of evaluate male parents and female parents and see if they're passing it on like this. All right, let me clear. Okay, let's do this one. This is a question that you might encounter as you're going through an exam or something. Which way could this be inherited? So right off the bat, we have a situation where affected people can be born to people who are not affected. So this male in generation 4, person 2, has 2 parents who don't have the trait. So this eliminates anything that's dominant. So we saw dominant alleles have to show the trait every generation where they're present, and they can't just disappear in a generation. All right, autosomal recessive. So if it was recessive, let's just work through this. If it was caused by an autosomal recessive trait, in the examples, all right, this one always gets tricky. I like to simplify this a whole bunch and say that people coming from outside the family would not carry the disease allele. So if we use that as one of our criteria, all these individuals who are coming in from outside the family, they don't bring in the little a allele, that would actually prevent this person from being homozygous recessive, right? So that wouldn't be possible here or anywhere else in the tree where people are bringing in their DNA from outside the family. I'll just mention it here. So I like to enforce that that's not possible, but if you were, say, working as a genetic counselor and this came up, you wouldn't want to rule out the possibility that somebody could come in from outside the family with that rare allele and actually combine that in. So if that was the case, that could be possible, maybe. I'm going to clear it. We're just going to move on from that. So we've eliminated basically 3 possibilities. What if we had X-linked recessive? Is that possible? So male to have the trait is hemizygous. He would then pass that on to his daughters. And then can it be that these 2 individuals, I'm running out of space here, X big A Y doesn't have the trait. Could these parents have an affected son oops, go with that. So X big A, X little a, X big A, Y is the combination. Could they have an affected son? Sure enough, they could. X little a, Y is possible. Half of their boys would be affected, so this is in fact possible. And we also see this pattern where the distribution of affected individuals are all males in this. So this is consistent with, and sorry, I meant to circle that. It looks like it crossed it out. D is possible. So X-linked recessive is in fact possible. We worked it out for one of these. You could work it out for every individual on here. A very similar pattern here. So a male has a daughter who has an affected male. Male has a daughter who has an affected son. And then basically, if you didn't see this showing up, parents of affected men, female parents of affected men would be carriers for this trait. So fill in a whole bunch of carriers there. Okay. Best way to practice this is to do these on your own. I think I've got some practice ones you can do, maybe in prep for the exam. Okay, let me